Hi folks, welcome to today's color process video. Obviously, since today's comic is based on the work of Charles Schulz, obviously the artist who is behind Peanuts, I wanted not just the line work, but I wanted the colors to somewhat be not entirely out of the realm of how a traditional Peanuts comic would be colored. Obviously, as with the line work, I took some liberties and added some of my own particular quirks to it. But one of the things that I decided to do, if it was going to be more along the lines of Schulz's work, was that everything, for the most part, would be rendered entirely in flats. I was thinking of adding some like texture work and like painterly kind of gradients and whatnot to the piece, but I felt that if I did that, it would be kind of taking it a bit too far away from how the original Peanuts comics looked when they had full color. And the comic already has enough different elements that I felt they, more than anything would get across that obviously this is a comic by me and it's definitely not a Peanuts comic. I mean, it doesn't look anywhere near as good as a Peanuts comic for one. Um, but where I did make an exception with say adding kind of more a more rendered approach to the colors was the reveal of the creature, or the full reveal of the creature in the last panel. Now, originally I was going to just leave that as just a pure just spot black, kind of like what you see with the silhouette of the character in the fourth and sixth panels. However, there was a problem with that where the way I had drawn the eyes, where the pupils are going upwards to the top corners of the eyes, what ended up happening when I filled in the character with black was those pupils looked like they were a part of the body. So it left it so that the eyes, like the whites of the eyes, were just slits, these little white slits on the head. And I very specifically wanted the eyes to have this off kind of look to them. I didn't want this creature to look, I didn't want it to look kind of like the stereotypical evil creature with like evil looking eyes. And unfortunately, when I filled the creature in with black, like those, the way the eyes looked, it gave them a more typical kind of evil look. Whereas I wanted them to look weirdly off and almost goofy, but in a strange way. So as a result, I decided that I would need to just add like a touch of rendering to at least the character's face, just to give the effect of like almost like the character is made up of like an oily substance or something. So what I ended up doing in the end was I ended up going for almost like an underlit approach to the character, where I just added like a just a gray tone to the black that I'd filled the character with. And I used the ghost brush that I typically use in my pieces to do like the more rendered kind of gradients and whatnot. And yeah, in the end, I'm glad that little mistake happened with the eyes, because I quite like how the character turned out in the end, like giving it that more rendered approach, because it makes it stand out all that more from this like this cartoony world where everything's like just these like nice kind of flat cartoon tones, and then you've got this creature standing in the middle of it that just looks off. I mean, it already would have looked off being this giant shadow thing, but just adding that kind of rendered look to it, it further gives it that kind of like it shouldn't be here kind of look. And I also used that the rendered approach in the initial reveal of the character with the light shining behind it. And originally, I was intending on with the like further getting across like the brightness of that light behind it by oh, what am I trying to say? Yeah, words are gone. Hold on. Yeah, I wanted to get across the brightness of the light by filling in the sky in the background, that kind of pink color I went with for the first and last panels, and around where the light is, I would have like fill that in with white and just gradually like just gradient that into like blend it into the pink of the sky. And to test it out initially, I just used the Photoshop's like typical gradient tool, and it just didn't quite work for me. It instead of looking like a bright light, yeah, it wasn't as effective as just the plain line work was. So instead, what I did was I just left the line work as is. No, I added like a touch of color to the line work, obviously, but other than that, I left it as it was. And then to better get across the brightness of that light, I took the gray that I used to render that character in the last panel, and I just gradually just like blended that into the black of the character. And then I got a lighter version of that gray and just added that to the edges of that other gray that that I laid down. And this gives a very nice kind of like bloom effect, you know, like light spilling over the edges of the character. And I could have achieved this just by going for my typical bloom effect, which I do by uh, getting the freehand lasso tool, setting its feather to about 20 or 30, and then I'll go around the line work of a character, just fill in a selection with that tool, and then the because it's feathered, it'll kind of it'll soften out the the edges of the selection, and so when I fill that in with white, it will give this fairly convincing looking bloom effect. However, that sometimes can look a bit artificial, and in this case, I just wanted to try it out. I just wanted to see if I could do a bloom effect without having to do it that way. You know, like being able to do it with just like a few strokes of a brush, so to speak. And yeah, it ended up a lot more convincing looking than I thought it would. So I was very pleasantly surprised by that. As for the rest of the comic, the color scheme I went with, the pink sky was, I mean, I just like pink skies. I like purples and pinks and whatnot. But I wanted this comic to have a slightly off kilter kind of atmosphere, even when that giant isn't there. I still wanted this comic to feel like Peanuts, but done by me. Um, so yeah, I went for slightly more desaturated colors than Schultz tended to use as well. At least going by the pages I was looking at for research, where he tended to use these fairly fairly saturated kind of light colors, and for whatever reason, the initial colors I'd laid down, they weren't quite working for me. I The characters weren't really contrasting against them very well, so I lightened the colors and I also desaturated them quite a bit. In fact, for a good chunk of the time that I was working on this, the grass was going to be this kind of grayish blue kind of color, but there was something about it that wasn't quite working for me. So I eventually nudged that up to, well, I mean, it is green, but it's not like a bright, pastoral kind of green. And yeah, it's just one of those cases where I just like keep messing around with things until, as I've mentioned before, I get something that works. What else can I talk about here? Yeah, the fifth panel where I have Lucy turning to look up at what kicked Charlie. Um, why did I go grayscale with the background there? I think I just wanted that panel to kind of stick out a bit more and almost have like a sense of impending dread to it. And I was thinking of adding like a filter on top almost that would, or like a changing the color scheme of that panel, like both Lucy and the background, to like kind of like a red or just something that would look kind of off. However, I realized very quickly that if I went for a red color in that panel, it would kind of blend into the last panel. And obviously I didn't want that to happen. I want the reader's eyes to go across the page as they should. So I just started messing around and I added what was it? I added an adjustment layer on top of both Lucy and the background, and I set that to just desaturate everything, just to change it all to grayscale. And yeah, there was something about it that just worked for me. It kind of gave it almost this like, it almost expands the time that that panel takes. Like, it's hard to explain, but yeah, it almost messes with the span of time in that panel. It almost stretches it out even just a little, even just by like a split second. But it still didn't quite work for me. And then I all I did was I took the adjustment layer and I moved it down so that it was just above the background, but Lucy didn't get affected. So then you got like that age old thing of like, color on top of black and white. And I mean that does tend to be a fairly striking visual, and it just seemed to work. Again, it was one of those things where it just clicked for me, so I stayed with it. I think maybe one of the reasons it works, or at least I hope it works, is because the panel immediately coming after it is basically grayscale as well. So I think, it ties those two panels together very nicely. Whereas what I was intending on going for before, it would have maybe messed up the flow of things a bit. But yeah, so yeah, I think I've I've rambled on long enough about this one. So yeah, I'm sure you can tell I'm quite happy with how this one turned out. So yeah, thank you very much for watching, and I will talk to you at the next video. Take care.